Hello, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropo Scene. The scene is set. The trees fly past you as you drive through the winding roads towards your favorite part of Appalachia. The light flitters through the greenery, creating a sea of bokeh in the early morning light. You feel yourself slowing down, knowing you're drawing nearer to your destination. Excitement is quickly replaced by confusion. An unfamiliarity washes over you as you realize you recognize nothing. No matter, wrong turns happen. You swing the car around and head back the way you came. But no, there's the sign for the trail entrance, the only recognizable feature in a now sea of green. Not the green of the lichen from the limestone cliffs that were once visible throughout, not the green of the diverse tree species which formerly grew tall and healthy above your head. In fact, everything is green, and only green. A singular green from a singular plant that chokes out all before it. And hello, nerds. Welcome to season 2 of the Anthropo Scene podcast. We are back.
Season 2. I'm so excited. Nicholas, how are you?
I am doing good. So for those of you who might think that Kirsten and I hang out all the time outside of filming the Anthropo Scene podcast, this is the first time we've talked or really met since the last episode of the last season.
It is true, and I have missed you, so it is good to be back.
I also missed you. Yes, it is good to be back in my living room.
And me, I am actually abroad right now, so anyone that is noticing my sound quality is maybe worse than usual, I apologize in advance.
Right. So this is the first episode of season 2, and it has been quite a while since season 1. So we thought we would maybe quickly reintroduce ourselves and sort of discuss our credentials and why we're doing this podcast for anybody who may be a new listener. But if you do want to know more about the details behind the Anthropo Scene podcast and who we are and what we do and what the podcast is more or less about, you'll get a pretty good idea from this episode. But we do have a pre-recorded episode, which is, I believe, episode 0, available for download or streaming or whatever. And it does explain everything in much greater detail. And we don't want to bother going through it again for you right now. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicholas. My pronouns are he, him. And I am a restoration ecologist from Northern Illinois, about an hour and a half away from Chicago, for those of you who might be out of the country and not know which state Illinois is. We're the one with Chicago. That's about all we got. So I am, like I said, a restoration ecologist, and I have always had a focus and an expertise on invasive species management and removal. I have traveled to many different parts of the country studying and working with many different types of both floral and faunal invasive species. And I continue to work with them not as just a more or less quote unquote hobby, but as my actual job. The predominant part of my job is actually working with and removing invasive species. So that is essentially why I am part of this podcast, I guess.
Right. Sounds good. Sounds about right.
Yeah, right. Tracks.
Yeah. Well, and Nicholas, it was his idea for this podcast, and I was lucky enough to jump on that train. So that's exciting.
Right. Yeah. There was just a line of people lining up to be my co-hosts. I think I interviewed 1.5 people.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
All right. So I am Kirsten, she, her pronouns. I am an ecologist by trade. I am from Western Canada. I studied at the University of Calgary. Now I'm mostly a SciCommer working towards a career in a bunch of different things for SciComm. I'm also like a freelance content creator. I do a bunch of random jobs that don't have to do with biology, but they're still there. I am mostly interested in like large scale interactions, which is why definitely invasive species are so interesting to me. I accidentally keep falling into entomology, and I seem to be staying there. So I did my honors on bumblebees, and I'm working now in a lab in Ecuador on some really neat biodiversity of soil invertebrates. So stay tuned for that. I'm going back to the lab, so it could be interesting to talk a little bit about that work at some point. But yeah, I'm just really happy to be here. I just want people to love ecology and science and everything. So excited to be here and help everybody get excited about ecology and the human dynamic of it as well.
Right on. Cool, 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 cool. So I think at this point, we might as well just jump right into it. This episode is going to follow our standard, I guess, form of what we have for podcast episodes, but I wanted to kind of take a little bit of an anecdotal step away to just sort of bring to light why we did start this episode and why we decided to kind of dust off the old microphones to record season 2, because this was a bit premature. I think we were planning on waiting more towards winter, but I kind of got I want to say hot pants, but that's not the expression I'm looking for. My pants were not hot. Hot feet, right?
Okay.
Hot feet? No, cold feet is the expression, and that's not what I mean.
I'm not even sure.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Antsy? Like
antsy, I guess yeah, whatever. I don't know. I got fire ants in my pants. I had hot pants. Whatever I was trying to say, I got excited about this specific topic. And essentially, I have the luxury of spending some time down in Appalachia, basically once a year. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Appalachia, it's like the Appalachian mountain range in eastern the US. So it happens to be like the salamander capital of the world, which is why I was down there primarily. But while I was down there, and every time I go down there, I've had a lot of experience just basically observing the destructive effects of the plant we're going to be talking about today, which is, of course, arguably one of the worst invasive species in the world, and that is, of course, kudzu. So I thought that starting off with possibly one of the most famous invasive species, at least when you talk about invasive species, it seems like you're hitting on kudzu at some point or another. Obviously, it depends on where you're at in the world, but for the most part, if we're just talking about sheer aggression and detrimental effects, kudzu is definitely at the top. So, firstly, we should probably talk about what is kudzu, because it has a very weird sounding name, and it doesn't necessarily give you a lot of clues as to what the plant is like. So, what is kudzu? Well, we will be specifically talking about the Poraria species. So, originally, my thought was that kudzu was a singular species, but it does seem as though, depending on where you're at, there are different species that comprise the genus. And that's obvious because obviously there's not just one plant in the genus Poraria. But what I'm referencing is that which multiple of the species within the genus are invasive. It seems like it's Poraria montana and then Poraria something else's that is the other main one, but montana seems to be the main one that is referenced in most literature, and it definitely is the species that seems to be plaguing the southeastern United States. So that's the one we're probably going to be focusing on and talking about the most, but in general, we're talking about Poraria species or Poraria species. So anyway, if I'm going to describe to you what this plant is, first off, it's a vine. So it's not like a bush, it's not a grass, it's not your standard broadleaf plants. It is a vine. It is exactly what you think a vine would look like. But the leaves are essentially, think of a maple leaf, but where the edges of the maple leaf are rounded. And instead of having one big leaf, it's segmented into 3 smaller sections. So if you were to like take the lobes of a maple leaf and split it off, because a maple leaf has the 3 lobes, if you split each of those off, that's essentially what their like leaf structure looks like, more or less. And it's easier to identify by the fact that when you see it, it is just decimating the ecosystems in which it is present. So that's probably going to be the primary way of identifying it, which is semi-rare because oftentimes not every single person who looks at an invasive species can identify it as an invasive species right away, but you can immediately see the effects of this plant, which does separate it out from some of the other species that we talk about.
Okay, good start.
So, like I said, the kudzu we'll be discussing today are the kudzu vines. I don't know if there's other core area species that are not vines, but the ones we're talking about are vines. These vines are insanely aggressive and are actually considered to be one of the most detrimental invasive species in the world. So, like, obviously, there's no way, or alternatively, there is a ton of different ways in which you can quantify the impacts that an invasive species has. So basically what I'm saying is it's up to an opinion, because some people might say, well, this species is the most detrimental because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, no. It's this species because of blah, 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 blah. So it's up to anyone's opinion on what is the most detrimental. You could put it in a monetary value. You could put it in it kills this many species value, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But that being said, kudzu is one of the most, or has one of the most dramatic impacts on every trophic level and every taxa within an ecosystem. So it is not difficult to imagine why this genus is often considered by many to be the worst invasive species ever. So if you look at a lot of lists online and you categorize like what is the worst invasive species in the world, a lot of times at the top of that list is kudzu, or it's at least in the top 3 or 5. And again, that's open to interpretation, but the fact that it's referenced so frequently as something that is the most worst invasive is enough of an argument to make that it's probably pretty damn bad.
All right. So long story short, it's bad.
Yeah, it real bad.
All right.
This is coming from someone who has the unfortunate privilege to work with many different invasive species, both flora and fauna. I don't necessarily know if I have ever seen a more devastating invasive species than kudzu. And that's like a genuine assessment. I will go into like more detail about that later, but that's genuinely me. That's not me sitting here to like, oh, this is the first episode of season 2. Like, I better say this is the worst one. No, this is like for real. Like, kudzu is the reason we're doing this episode of this podcast right now, obviously. But it's the reason we restarted the podcast, and I am like so gung-ho about this, is because its effects are terrifying. And the implications of its spread is also terrifying. And we'll discuss that in a little bit. So first things first, as you guys know, if you've listened before, we always like to break down what the plant is like in its native habitat, because it's good to get an idea of where invasive species come from, what purpose they're serving in their ecosystem, and if they are either doing well or doing poorly in their native ecosystem, because oftentimes we vilify invasive species, which it's easy to do because they're destroying the ecosystems that we cherish in one way or another. You have to remember that it's our fault. You're putting the blame and the anger on the wrong entity. The species that are invasive, it's not their fault. They're just doing what they've evolved over hundreds of thousands or millions of years to do. We just put them in a place that they would never, ever be in. So it's our fault. So if you're going to get mad at somebody, get mad at us. It's us. It's always us. So anyway, as you might imagine, and it is pretty common for pretty much every invasive species we discuss, within its native habitat, kudzu is not considered invasive or noxious.
What the hell did you just say?
Invasive.
That's not even a word, and I agree with you.
That's approximately as much citable information as I could find. It's about as far as the research into native kudzu goes. There's not a lot of research done, and that is probably definitely because most of the research efforts are done into the beneficial medicinal uses of kudzu and also the eradication of kudzu because it's so invasive. So I'm sure with a little bit more digging, you might be able to find what its ecological niche is and things like that. But essentially, its native range is Japan, China, and most of the Indian subcontinent. So kudzu seems to be of such a little consequence in the native range that there just isn't much research done on it. So yeah, that's about as far as that goes. But I would like to take this little moment to kind of explain this principle. So for many of us, it may seem totally obvious as to why a species that is so aggressive in other parts of the world is not at all an issue within its native habitat. If you are someone who is finding yourself asking, why isn't kudzu as aggressive in its natural habitat? Do not at all feel bad. We're here to explain the basic ideas of ecology, and this is one of those principles that we might as well touch on. Mm-hmm. So think of it like this. Within the native habitat, kudzu has evolved alongside other plants and animals, of course, that have had to compete against it for probably millions of years. Because this ecosystem evolution took place over such a long period of time, the species within the native habitat had time to adapt so that one doesn't necessarily outcompete the other. Also, animals, and this includes insects, would evolve to eat the kudzu at a rate that would naturally control it. Naturally, plants and animals are not able to adapt or change quickly enough to vastly overwhelm their natural ecosystem. So basically, the ecosystem is sequestering the ability of plants and animals to grow beyond their carrying capacity. That's how ecosystems work. They all are limited by the natural factors that they've evolved alongside. When you introduce something to an ecosystem it would never come into contact with, all of those natural limiting factors that are present in the native ecosystem are now gone. So this plant that has evolved over millennia to grow incredibly aggressively to outcompete the other plants and also keep up with predation in its native habitat now will grow uninterrupted because it's been introduced into an area that doesn't have those plants or animals to prevent it from growing so readily. So there's also the possibility of a higher availability of nutrients and climatic factors that improve the growth into an introduced habitat. So essentially, it might not just be the limiting factors removed like predation and things like that. It could also be that it's introduced to a habitat that might just be a better environment for it to grow. It might have more of the nutrients that it's adapted to try and get more of because they're lacking in its natural environment. For example, just to put this into perspective, carnivorous plants have grown to get nitrogen from harvesting food in the form of insects and other animals. But if you take a carnivorous plant out of a bog that is a naturally low nitrogen environment and you put it into potting soil that has a lot of nitrogen in it, that plant will grow and you don't need to feed it at all. So, and it will probably grow better than a lack of nitrogen environment that it normally grows in. So that's kind of the basic principle here behind better growing conditions. Just so I put that a little bit into better perspective for everyone.
Yeah, like if you look at it visually, like a way that I like to think of it is if you think about like a classic textbook food web where you have, you know, like your primary producers and then you have, I don't know, like a mouse and then a snake and then a hawk. Like you have, you know, this visual that we're so used to seeing with all the arrows, which is simplified, but we know that it works more or less. And then you're just bringing something in and just imagine like stamping it in its own little circle with no other arrows around it, sort of thing, except for it being able to use the nutrients or to eat the other things. But it's just like throwing it in there without connecting it to the things that are already connected in a way.
Absolutely. And just to also like, just to say something, I guess, it's not just that every plant that's taken out of its native habitat and somewhere else becomes invasive. We introduce like tons and tons and tons of different species of plants that are non-native every single year. However, we don't think about most of them because they are limited by this new environment wherever they're introduced to.
We talked in the Q&A episode from the fans. The last little bit of that episode is what makes things a good invasive species. Because like you said, not everything is good at being invasive.
Right, exactly. So we just know about the invasive ones because they're invasive. They cause us problems. So yeah, you know, you put enough non-native species in an area, some of them are going to be invasive. That's just how it works. So where is this plant currently invasive? Because I've referenced the southeastern United States for the most part, and that is definitely like the predominant area. Like when we're talking about kudzu, we're probably referencing that area. But there is a lot of reports of it and the other Poraria species spreading. So there's reports of species in North Dakota and Oregon, which we'll talk about that a little bit later as to why that's a little bit bizarre. But we're also looking at it spreading north towards New York and west towards Texas. So that is obviously an issue. And we'll also talk about the spread of this species a little bit at the very end. So never mind. We're going to talk about it right now. I just wrote this script today.
Keep it together, man.
So it is also worth mentioning at this point that climate change may in fact aid in the spread of kudzu to areas where it wouldn't normally be able to grow. Like I mentioned, North Dakota and Oregon. One of the biggest limiting factors in kudzu growth up until this point has been climate, and it doesn't like the significantly colder areas. But if Pueraria species are now being found in New York, Oregon, and North Dakota, which is basically Canada, then we have some serious problems. So think of it this way. One of the limiting factors of kudzu spread is obviously its intolerance to colder temperature. As the climate is shifting and global temperatures are increasing, the possibility for kudzu to spread at a faster rate to areas where it is not currently able to establish is significantly increased. And this is a cited source too. I'm not just speculating. There has been research that's done into this. In fact, Bradley, B.A., Wilkov, D.S., and Oppenheimer, M. discuss this in a 2010 study where they looked at climate trends and modeled potential spread of invasive species due to increased global temperatures. And let me just say the projections for 2100 are horrifying, to say the least. I won't get into the details. They model a bunch of different invasive species, one of them being kudzu. But if we're already seeing them pop up in colder climates, and there's also more cold tolerant Pueraria species, we need to do something fast. So this kind of leads into why is it so successful? Obviously, we discussed a little bit about why invasive species in general is successful, but now we're going to get into the details of the nitty gritty of why is kudzu so bad? Because I've talked about how bad it is, but I haven't really explained it yet. I kind of let you guys on the edge of your seat, so you have to listen to the whole episode. So you got to learn stuff. So kudzu is actually known as the mile-a-minute plant. It has an insanely fast growth rate. I'm not exaggerating when I say an insanely fast growth rate. We're talking like bamboo levels of insanely fast here. Some people will actually say that you can see it grow. And while I'm not necessarily sure that that is true in of itself, I can confirm that you can hear it growing. You can actually hear kudzu, like big areas of kudzu. You can hear it when it grows. So because it's such an aggressive vine that stretches and rubs against anything, and you get this dense mat of basically monoculture, massive vines everywhere, you can actually hear a large mass of kudzu stretching and moving up against itself and other organic matter. So it's like this kind of like squeaking and crunching and cracking that you get from the plant because it's growing so quickly. And if this seems like hard to believe, because a lot of people are going to be like, yeah, all right, you can hear it grow, you can see it grow. Yeah. Okay. Kudzu can grow 18 meters, which is 60 feet per season, not per year. So that means that it's up to a third of a meter or 1 foot per day that this plant is growing. Up to 1 foot per day. So since kudzu grows in the South, is able to grow for longer periods of time, which allows it to cover massive acreages every year. Because you think of it this way, it's not just one plant that's growing a foot a day, which is scary in of itself. It's masses of probably thousands of different vines that are all branching off one another, and each of those is growing a foot. So it's quickly overtaking areas. It can take over acres in a year. So you could have an area that didn't have kudzu a year before and the next year just be covered in it. Think of it this way. A single plant grows 1 foot per day, right? Kudzu is reproducing readily. So it can reproduce by seeds, but it's actually more likely that it's putting the vines into the ground and growing from nodules that form under the surface. So as it's growing, one plant is becoming multiple plants over and over again. And each of those plants is putting out new vines that are stretching at the rate of a foot or a third of a meter every single day.
Yeah.
So by doing this, it's expanding that growth range like substantially. It's scary how fast it can actually overtake areas. Typically, when we think of invasive plants, we think about their effects on nutrient availability and things of that nature that have more or less indirect effects on existing plant communities. Well, kudzu is, of course, doing all of these things. It's growing like super fast. It's taking up the nutrients that the other plants can use. Of course, it's doing that. But the reason that it is really problematic lies within the fact that it is a vine, because this would be the first invasive vine species that we've talked about. For the most part, we've talked about other herbaceous invasives, or in the case of your last episode, the invasive trees.
Trees, yeah.
which are like niche occupation. Essentially, they're taking the nutrients that are available and taking up some level of space, but that's more or less indirect effects on the plants. It's not like it's actively removing plants. Would you
Mhm.
agree with that?
Mostly, the eucalyptus does have allelopathy where it like
Oh, that is
chemically gets
true.
rid of some, but it's true. Like a lot of the times, the problems with plant competition is what you're talking about, the indirect using up the resources, using up whether that be sun, water, nutrients. Yeah, a lot of the times it's predominantly indirect effects, I would say.
Right.
Yes.
So this is where it starts to get a little scary. So because kudzu is a vine, it's not just confined to the ground. It's not just confined to that one to that one area in the ground. In fact, it will readily climb and cover pretty much any object in its path. Look this up. Google this. It will grow over cars, rock walls. It will completely cover buildings and even trees, like living trees. The combination of the lack of sunlight that reaches under this tangled mess and the sheer weight of the plant mass that kudzu brings when it grows over something basically means that it can quite literally pull and rip down trees and open up woodlands where the ground becomes a complete mass of tangled vines and no canopy midstory or anything exists after kudzu grows through an area. It is pulling down trees that are like 100 feet tall. It is ridiculous the effects that it has, because obviously when a vine grows over the top of something, it suffocates out the sunlight, which causes the tree to lose its structural integrity. And then the weight of all that added organic matter, plus the fact that vines kind of pull down, will rip the trees down. And I'm not talking about like little tiny itty bitty trees. I'm talking about like massive trees, massive,
Right.
huge, 100-year-old trees can get ripped down. Following that, or I guess adding on to that, these vines are so thick on the ground level that wildlife basically has an impossible time trying to move through it. This isn't even mentioning the effects that kudzu has on the plant communities that sensitive fauna and flora need to survive. So when it actually suffocates out all those plant communities, kudzu is not a good replacement for the plants that animals need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But because those are so readily wiped out, it basically leaves nothing but a mess of tangled kudzu and fallen trees, which is uninhabitable by most of the life that calls these super biodiverse areas home. So why or how was kudzu introduced? This is going to get pretty interesting. Many times, because of global trade, travel, and all those types of things, invasive species sort of volunteer themselves in places where they don't normally belong. Accidental introductions are incredibly common amongst invasive species and happen more frequently than you might actually think. However, annoyingly, kudzu was not such a case. As frustrating as it may sound, kudzu was purposefully introduced multiple times and encouraged to grow both by the public and the government alike. So it's important to remember before I get everyone riled up about how dumb this seems, that all of the stuff I'm about to talk about was done like well before we had any real understanding of the effects of invasive species on ecosystems. But with that being said, let's get mad.
You're angry? You started tooting! I'm angry! I have never been this angry in my entire life!
Right. Well, just before you get into it, just as an outsider perspective, like as you're saying, I mean, it's terrifying how much like the kudzu takes up, but I could see it being such a beautiful like vine plant to like cover walls and things like that if it's like covers so much space. So I think I see where you're going with this, but we can get mad.
Oh, we're gonna get more mad. You did hit one of the nails on the head, but that's just the beginning of this fun train of a shit show. So
Okay.
between 1876 and 1910, kudzu was introduced as an ornamental for the reasons that Kirsten basically just outlined. As the vine looked beautiful in botanic gardens that were present in Japan and throughout Asia, people wanted it in their gardens. It made sense to have it in the gardens. It grew quickly and it was incredibly easy to grow. And yeah, it looked good in the landscaping. So then following that, between 1910 and 1935, kudzu was planted as grazing material and hay pasture. So essentially it grows really quickly. It covers areas that other things won't grow in, and you can graze it for livestock and things like that, which is pretty, desirable if you're a farmer. And then finally, we have probably the biggest slap in the face of all, which was between 1935 and 1955. Kudzu was encouraged to be planted by the government and land managers as a form of erosion control. They actually offered incentives to encourage people to plant kudzu on their property as erosion control. They even put other incentives in place for farmers who planted acres of it and for anyone who used it as just general erosion control, because they were trying to control the erosion that they had caused from farming and things like that, instead of,
boy.
establishing the native plants back. Basically, what am I saying? How did one of the most aggressive plants on the planet become so quickly widespread in the American South? We put it there.
I'm sure this decision won't haunt you forever.
And before we go on to the next topic, we are going to take a short break. So we will see you when we get back. Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of the Anthropo Scene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropo Scene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
And we're back. Before we move on to the quote unquote what is being done section of our podcast, I actually wanted to take some time and talk anecdotally about my experience with kudzu and the direct effects it has on an ecosystem. I think that if I sort of take this moment right now to give a very specific experience that I've had regarding this plant, I might be able to paint a more appropriate picture for everyone listening, because I can sit here and I can talk about detrimental effects of this plant for, hours and hours, and I will, because that's how I operate. But I think for the listeners, it's probably going to be more interesting to hear a specific example, someone who's experienced it firsthand. Now, if you're listening to this and you're in kudzu territory, you already know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But this specific experience is probably different from one that you've had, and I bet you that it will sort of be a very telling experience of how serious that the problem of kudzu can actually be.
If anybody does want to share their story, you can type it up and send us to our Instagram, and we can share it as well with people at some point.
Yeah, we're all about that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So like I mentioned at the beginning, I spend some time in North Carolina towards the end of summer every year. For those of you guys who don't know, I talked about it a little bit, but North Carolina is the salamander capital of the world, having somewhere around 60 described species, and that number is very likely to keep climbing within the next few years. Spoiler alert. Anyway, some of these species of salamanders are hyper-specific. There are several species that can basically only be found within the crevices of like massive rock faces. So for time's sake, we're going to refer to these types of salamanders as crevice salamanders, and I'm not going to break down individual species. If you know anything about salamanders and you focus on North Carolina, or if you focus on Appalachian salamanders to any degree, you will understand the species I'm talking about. I will reference one specific, but the crevice salamanders in general is how we're going to be referring to them. Being that these salamanders obviously have hyper-specific habitats that already makes them pretty vulnerable to disturbances. As you imagine, if you're a salamander that only lives in certain rock crevice cracks or whatever that are highly dependent on specific flora and fauna and shade and moisture and all of these different factors, you're going to be pretty sensitive to any sort of disturbance or environmental impact, whatever that may be. So while I was searching for some of these species on a massive rock wall, a friend of mine who is basically the salamander whisperer down there was telling me how just a year ago, there actually used to be other rock walls in the areas that had these salamanders present. Unfortunately, when he gestured to where like those rock walls used to be, all that remained was a complete wall of kudzu. So essentially, let me try and paint an image for you guys. Mm-hmm. I am out in the middle of the woods, far from civilization, looking on this rock wall, in dense foliage and things like that. We're looking at like rhododendron, we're looking at like different tree species, bunch of different herbaceous species, ferns and all that kind of fun stuff everywhere. And it's super biodiverse. And in these habitats, these plants have created a very like shaded, moist, and good environment for these crevice salamanders to live in. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is the kudzu overtakes that. It basically suffocates out all light. It prevents everything from growing. I mean, like the vines grow up the rocks and cover every square inch of the rock. It's not just like a vine that you might see crawling up a rock, like a poison ivy vine or a grapevine or something like that. No, this is a complete mat. Like if you look, I'm thinking of like Wrigley Field or like baseball diamonds or like old buildings when the whole wall is covered in like English ivy and stuff like that.
Right.
That level of coverage where there is nothing underneath. That's what we're looking at. So when we were out there, we were actually looking for hickory nut gorge salamanders, which are the most recently described species of salamander back in 2019. So just a couple years ago, this salamander species was described as science. And unfortunately, some of the population estimates have it at around 250 individuals. Now, normally I have citations for numerical values and things like that, but I actually could not find this one. I've been told about it by several different people, and also some of the papers that we have reference population estimates of 250 individuals, but I couldn't find the initial paper. But just note that at best, it's a few hundred individuals of this species that are left. Being that there's such a cryptic and site-specific species, they probably don't have high density of a population in general, but the added pressure is going to do no favors for an animal that's under this much pressure. So unfortunately, the rock wall that used to hold some of these salamanders was completely covered by kudzu, and my salamander whisperer guy basically told me that only 8 months ago that was a completely open rock face that you could go and you could find this species on, and unfortunately it had been completely overgrown by kudzu. So within less than a year, the kudzu had encroached in that habitat, and unfortunately within another year or two, the spot that we had been searching for these salamanders was very likely also going to be overgrown, which is incredibly depressing and incredibly difficult to know that it's going to happen because of how incredibly rare the species that call those rock walls home are. So that was my main experience with kudzu, as far as like where I realized like how serious the impacts of this species could be on the very, very sensitive different salamander species that call North Carolina home. Being that there's 60 species of salamander, it does mean that there are a lot of salamander species that don't have high populations. So any disturbance could be enough to just wipe those animals clean off the face of the planet. And that is terrifying to think of as a concept.
I was just going to say it's like very sad, but it's such an interesting like interaction that an animal species is being like so heavily directly affected by an invasive plant like this. So it's crazy. Yeah, these little endemic guys that just live in this tiny little space are so vulnerable, and that's all it takes is one rogue plant. That's
right. It's very quantifiable when you have a species with numbers that small. But you have to imagine that on a much larger scale, the same thing is taking place for all of the common species of salamander, and not just salamander. It's the flora and fauna that are just being decimated by kudzu, unfortunately. So now we get into the what's being done about it? Why has more effort not been done to preserve these species, and et cetera, et cetera? And I'll kind of touch upon that in different ways, but this one's a little bit different. To me, it's, as someone who does restoration management, this is an incredibly interesting form of that. Now, on the types of control that we talk about when we're talking about invasive species control, that is chemical, mechanical, cultural, and biological. Chemical being like chemical application. Generally, we're thinking of herbicide, pesticides, and things like that are going to be sprayed directly on the plant or the pest. You've got mechanical, which is hand pulling or cutting or anything like that that is actually like physically removing of the invasive species. You've got cultural, which is essentially it's cultural practices that had done by indigenous people for thousands of years as land management practices. So that's like prescribed burning would be a really good example of that.
Pre-colonial land management, I guess you could say.
Exactly. Yeah. And then finally, you have biological. Biological being the introduction of some form of basically flora or fauna that is going to, quote unquote, naturally control an invasive species. So I oftentimes am focusing on chemical, mechanical, and cultural practices for management because there's a lot of negative connotation around biological control. A lot of times we think of, for example, the cane toad, which was introduced as a biological controlled method for the cane beetles. And obviously that did not go so well. And a lot of times people have a negative association with biological control and it often takes a backseat. But if you listen to one of our last episodes of the first season with Becca, who is doing research on parasitoid wasps on the emerald ash borer, that's a form of biological control. And with how much research is going into it, it's an effective and basically no strings attached type of biological control where there's not going to be negative impacts that result from introducing these biological control methods. So I encourage you to go check out that episode because I had a ton of fun filming it. Also, spoiler alert, she's coming back for another episode this season sometime. So stay tuned for that, probably be towards the end. But anyway, biological control does have these negative connotations most of the time. And I'm obviously focusing on this for some reason, which I will go into detail, but I just wanted to sort of hit a little bit harder on biological control because it's something we don't typically talk about as much. We're talking generally about mechanical, chemical, and cultural. So kudzu, unfortunately, it's so aggressive that it does need to be treated at multiple levels. So some entities will focus on kudzu management by basically just simply using different herbicides on top of one another. So like they'll use non-selective and selective herbicides in tandem treatment or at different times to just really knock it back. But this method can take like 10 years, like a full decade to properly management with just the chemical means. Not to mention the long-lasting effects of that much herbicide in an ecosystem are probably not great. And, that costs a lot of money. So that was chemical kind of checked off as not a super viable option. Now we're going to head into more of the mechanical side of things. So cutting in of itself isn't effective because, well, kudzu's perennial. That means it's a plant that comes back year after year. If you cut it, it's just going to grow back. If you cut an annual plant before it seeds out, that plant's going to die and you're controlling it that way. But because of the fact that kudzu is perennial, if you're cutting it, all you're doing is slowing its growth. It's not an effective control method. And obviously with the rate of growth that kudzu has, it's probably not going to really stop it at all if you're just using cutting. So even cutting and herbicide combinations can still take somewhere around 10 years to effectively manage an area that's covered in kudzu, which is not a good way to manage something. That's not an effective way to manage an invasive species. 10 years is an exceptionally long time. And if you're focusing for 10 years on a single area, well, kudzu grows so fast that it's already established in multiple other areas during that management time frame. So the time kudzu needs to be managed needs to be dropped significantly. Now, obviously, you can manage different areas at the same time within those 10 years. But if you're able to reduce that time frame, you're going to be more effective and branch out to more areas and get better on top of the problem. Let's circle back now to biological controls. So bioherbicides, what are they? Well, biological herbicides. It's kind of exactly what the name suggests. When we think of herbicides, I think we tend to think of artificial chemicals. That's essentially the standard, so it makes sense that that's what you would think of if you hear herbicide. However, herbicide is basically just any substance that has a lethal or controlling effects on plants. Herbicide, plant, kill, blah, blah, blah. But it also can be a hindering factor, as in it doesn't seed out or it doesn't allow the seeds to grow. It doesn't necessarily have to just kill it. So herbicide, like I said, is any substance that has lethal controlling effect on plants. Therefore, bioherbicides are actually living organisms or things that are derived from living organisms that attack plants. In the case of kudzu, it seems to be, based on my research, that it is being derived from a fungus called Myrothecium verrucaria. And the application of this fungal derivative to like broadleaf plants seems to be pretty effective to control the spread of kudzu, which is pretty awesome to think about, that basically you're spraying like the mycelium of a fungus on a plant to get it to just die. But as we've said, unfortunately, kudzu is so aggressive that even this method of control is not going to reach that 100% control level that you really want, and it will quickly return within a few years. So singular pronged attacks don't necessarily work. We've discussed the effectiveness of mechanical, chemical, and now biological control, and we've discussed all of the shortcomings of all of them. Cultural control would be another one where you would probably run prescription burns through the area, but burning the kudzu is not necessary. It's going to be the same effect as cutting it for the most part. It'll probably have some beneficial effect, but you can't burn year after year after year. That'll have negative effects on an ecosystem. So that also covers cultural. So we've talked about the shortcomings of all of them, which is why many entities are now turning to a multifaceted attack that begins with cutting and ends with spraying, but not just spraying, but a combination of both bioherbicides and chemical herbicides. And this method has actually been proven to be so effective that it can reduce the length of kudzu management down to just 2 years, which is 1/5 of what it typically takes to manage kudzu. It's still super aggressive, and it still is, time consuming and all that type of stuff, but it's definitely a more effective method of control. There's also reports of a kudzu specific herbicide, but I have searched high and low and I could not find an herbicide that is used for that. If anybody knows what herbicide, because many people have talked to me about this and have said that they've heard of it, but I haven't. I can't find any research to back up its efficacy. I can't even find what it might be. And I don't know if people are just talking about the fungal derivative, the bioherbicide, but that's not kudzu specific. That's like still a broadleaf type of management. So if anybody knows any more information about a kudzu specific herbicide and where it's at in like the testing and application process, I would be significantly interested in knowing more about that. So feel free to message us. Also, before we wrap up here, it's probably worth noting at this point that all of the resources I used here to cite throughout this podcast sort of in passing reference native plant restoration, which is an important thing to cover. So since kudzu suffocates out sunlight and it kills off any herbaceous or woody plants, and it quite literally rips down the bigger woody plants of any size, once it's eradicated, you're basically left with a blank slate, and you need to help native flora recover by establishing native plants in an area. So that's part of the management process that is required after kudzu, because even though it was introduced as erosion control. So if you remove all of the kudzu from an area, you're going to get significantly higher rates of erosion. So while you're removing that kudzu, you always have to put down native seed or native plugs to help secure that soil, to help the native plant communities recover, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that I wanted to mention, because it's important to remember that it's not just removal of non-native plants, but the establishment of the native plants as well. So we're basically done, but we do have a few.
I do have a question.
Oh, you do? Perfect. I do have devil's advocate stuff too.
Okay. So. Has anybody tried goats? Like, has that been a thing?
Oh, I think it has actually, but I didn't look into it, to be honest. I kind of focused more on the really effective, because if you think about it, because kudzu grows, and I know goats are good climbers and stuff, but like the kudzu is super good at growing over absolutely everything. So like a goat would maybe be effective at like controlling a very small area, but like a plant that grows at a rate of a foot a day, you're gonna have to have an army of goats.
Right. I mean, you'd be surprised. Like, they're pretty impressive little weed control guys, but I'm just wondering, like, using that as your mechanical and then going into the chemical and the biological herbicide. I think that could be interesting in some areas, maybe.
Oh yeah, absolutely. My only thought process is vines get super thick, and like a goat would not be able to I mean, they get like bigger than like soup can size and things like that. And then it's so high too, like up trees. But yeah, I mean, any sort of mechanical control is going to be better than no mechanical control. So yeah, know what level of viability we would call that, but I don't think there's necessarily like any harm in doing that, with the exception of maybe like goats becoming an invasive species in North Carolina. But
it would be controlled, right? Like they bring them in and they fence them off, and then they like let them out, and then they like take them to a new area.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, I was just curious if you came across that in your journey.
Yeah, I pretty much just focused on the chemical and mechanical. Usually I try to get a bunch of different methods. And I was going to actually go into a little bit more detail about like the medicinal, and like there's a bunch of different things where you're like harvesting the roots of it, I think, to make like tea or something, like, but I didn't think that was that's not necessarily effective control methods. That's just like something it can be used for.
All right, guys. So it is time for the debate round. Let's get into it. Okay, first one here. You mentioned back that we introduced it for erosional control and as like livestock feeding. So what are the implications of removing it in the areas that were so eroded? Like maybe it's better just to have that there than nothing, right?
Right. So I mentioned this kind of towards the end, basically saying like, once it's removed, it's immediately replaced with all of the management strategies have native plants being put in place. And those are going to be more beneficial as erosion control methods because they've naturally grown in those areas. And although it functions as an erosion control method because it moves so quickly, it actually doesn't necessarily hold the soil and stuff together as effectively as the native root systems would.
Okay.
And that being said, too, for like grazing land and things like that, it's actually more detrimental to farmers to have kudzu around because it destroys their livelihood and things like that. There's a lot of things that say you lose tons of productivity when kudzu is around, and farmers do realize that now. So even though it was introduced for those two purposes, it turns out that it doesn't actually really do those two purposes very well.
So it was introduced for livestock, but it's really not an effective crop for livestock consumption. Yeah. Okay. So with an invasive species this aggressive, that takes so long and so much resources to attack, like why, this is not Kirsten talking, this is the devil's advocate, but why even bother? Like we're just going to spend so much money and so much time and it's just like too far gone. So why bother?
Right. Well, annoying Kirsten. Basically, it's when we look at how detrimental kudzu is, we understand, and this is one of those invasives that it's not difficult to get public support on, which is a good thing. If one good thing comes out of this, because a lot of times people don't actually see the effects of this invasive, but this one's so aggressive that people do see and understand the negative implications of having this invasive species around. So people are understanding that if something's not done and it's not controlled, that it will destroy both their livelihood and just the natural biodiversity that calls the areas where kudzu is growing home. And unfortunately, it is pretty out of control, being that it was purposefully established versus a volunteer invasive species where you can get a little bit ahead of those. This one has a good foothold, and it is definitely an uphill battle. But with the more support and the more effective management strategies that are being developed with this, it's only a matter of time before more people are understanding the ecological impacts of managing kudzu. And it seems like they're already pretty in support of the different strategies that are going on.
Right. Very cool. All right. So yeah, we can do this.
Yeah.
All right. So I think as a tax-paying American that it's just way too much money to control it. So it's too much. I don't care.
Cool. So I'll keep this one short and sweet. It is estimated that kudzu in the United States causes a loss in productivity of $500 million every single year. And
my
as
God.
kudzu continues to spread, that number will only increase. Now, when I say loss in productivity, I am referring to both the productivity of farmable land and land for forest, timber, logging, all that kind of stuff, but also the natural lands of parks and things like that and their inherent value.
Right.
Whether it be in funding for people who pay for those parks and things like that. So yeah, that's $500 million estimates in annual productivity for the U.S. and that's from the U.S. Forest Service and the FDA. So you can trust those numbers. But yeah, that's horrifying, and that's right now. I mean, if kudzu continues to get out of control and to spread to other places, that number is going to just drastically increase. So yeah, it's
it's an investment. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. All right.
Cool. Well,
yeah,
that is the sad story of kudzu. And of course, if you guys have any sort of questions, comments, ideas for other episodes or things you'd like to see us do or change, feel free to message us on our Instagram or any of our other social media. And yeah, we're super excited to be back. I'm glad. I'm really happy to be a part of this again. And I guess Kirsten, you can take us out.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say, it's really sad and a hard story, but I want everybody to remain concerned yet hopeful because, environmental depression is a real thing. So let's keep working and keeping people aware of the situation. And yeah, thanks for waiting for us all summer. And we'll see you. I keep saying see in the next episode.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Anthropo Scene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.